In the glistening heart of the galactic core, where suns burned blue and planets spun like jewels in engineered harmony, only the most advanced civilizations were allowed to exist. They called it the Concord, a council of apex species who ruled the known universe through reason, science, and what they proudly called controlled enlightenment. And somewhere, beneath their towers of crystal, their sky-bound cities, their eternal symposiums, was the janitor. No name. No file. Just human specimen 43. He came from a planet most had forgotten or purposely ignored, Earth. A death world, they whispered, though few believed it anymore. Earth had gone dark nearly a century ago. Most assumed the humans had perished from their own savagery. But the Concord never truly forgets. They remembered enough to send scout vessels once every few decades. And 3 weeks ago, on one such mission, they found him. He was collecting trash along the outer edge of a decommissioned orbital station, just one man, a vacuum suit, and a handheld broom fashioned from scavenged ship parts. He didn't resist when they came. He didn't speak. He only turned, glanced at them through the cracked lens of his helmet, and waited. They shackled him. Ran scans. Injected him with nanobinders. Laughed as he was paraded through the halls of Echelon Prime, the crown jewel of their empire. A relic, one scientist said. A perfect specimen for behavioral study, another agreed. But most just called him what he appeared to be, the janitor. Assigned to subsector D9 of the lower maintenance decks, he was given a mop, a waste processor, and 3 shifts per rotation. No contact, no privileges. Just labor. And yet, strange things began to happen. Nothing large. Not yet. But the waste pipe stopped clogging. The malfunctioning servitors in D9 suddenly worked with renewed precision. Requests once ignored by Central Command began resolving themselves, as if by ghost. Some engineers attributed it to system reboots. Others joked the janitor was just really good at his job. But he wasn't just cleaning. He was watching. Every night, he studied the flow of foot traffic, memorizing access codes as they were punched in by lazy technicians. He traced maintenance corridors with his fingertips, feeling the slight electrical pulse of buried conduits. He took apart a broken drone left in a recycling chute and rebuilt it, not as a servant, but as a scout. The alien guards mocked him. Tossed food at his feet. Called him meat brush. He never responded. Until one day, one of them, drunk on spiced kale liquor, spat in his face and sneered, "Clean that, human." He did. Slowly. Calmly. But as he wiped the floor, he looked up. That look, it wasn't anger. It wasn't fear. It was calculation. A chill ran down the alien's spine. He couldn't explain it. Just a stare. Just a pair of dull brown eyes. But something behind them moved. Something ancient. Something vast. That night, the janitor returned to his quarters. He didn't sleep. Instead, he etched patterns into the wall with a broken nail. To most, they looked like scratches. But to him, it was the first layer of a plan. A schematic. A memory. Because they had no idea. No idea that before Earth went dark, he had been Strategic Commander Elias Wren, author of the Ghost Doctrine, architect of the Red Star offensives, thought to be dead in the final siege of Olympus Mons. They thought they'd captured a janitor. They had no idea they'd just shackled the man who once wrote battle plans so devastating, entire planets still bore their scars. He smiled that night, beneath the cold light of an alien moon. The mop was just a prop. The real weapon was coming. They still called him Janitor, even as reports started piling in. System alerts. Security irregularities. A drone found wandering sectors it had no clearance for. A command relay malfunctioning at precisely the time the waste processor jammed, forcing a detachment of engineers to reroute power from the lower decks. Coincidences, they said. Statistical noise, said Supervisor Alrex, a six-eyed analyst from the Ophidian caste. Nothing more than entropy. But entropy, Elias Wren knew, could be guided. Shaped. Used. He kept sweeping the same corridor. Day after day. Quiet. Predictable. The perfect prisoner. The perfect background character. But in silence, he calculated. The Concorde's arrogance was his camouflage. They couldn't conceive of a human being more than what they saw. Weak. Dull. Forgotten. Their minds were wired for hierarchy, subspecies existed to be ruled, categorized, broken into predictable outcomes. And humans? They had been a historical footnote at best. Until now. Elias had mapped 70% of subsector D9's security grid using reflections on polished pipes. He'd memorized guard rotations, power surges, air vent cycles. He knew that every 41.7 hours, the command uplink from the central AI flickered, just long enough for a signal to slip through. And slip through it did. On the third week of captivity, a message traveled via maintenance conduit 19 Zeta. Compressed into a cleaning bot's backup drive, encoded in what appeared to be random diagnostic data, it reached the outer comms array, a sector long since deemed irrelevant by the alien engineers. To the Concorde, it was background noise. Electromagnetic flutter. Dismissed instantly. But to Earth, it was a spark. A single line of code buried beneath layers of junk data. Asset Wren active. Inside the core. Begin phase echo. Back in D9, Elias wiped his brow and leaned on his mop. His hands ached. His back throbbed. He was 57 years old, alone on a hostile planet, with only his mind and a rusted maintenance keycard. But he had time. And time, for a strategist, was never wasted. The first alien to notice something was wrong wasn't a guard. It was a junior xenobiologist, Karel. Fresh from the citadel of minds. Too young to be cynical. Too curious to ignore patterns. He noticed that janitorial logs from subsector D9 didn't match foot traffic data. The logs claimed human activity in corridors that had been sealed off weeks ago. More concerning, atmospheric sensors in those same corridors showed fluctuations. Heat. Movement. Brief, but real. He filed a report. And it disappeared. He filed another. This time, it was flagged. 2 cycles later, Karel vanished. The official memo said he'd returned to his homeworld. Emotional fatigue. But one technician swore she saw his ID chip blinking red, a sign to containment. Still, the janitor cleaned. Until one night, during routine drain clearance, a guard taunted him again. "Do you know what this place is, human? This is the core. The center of all civilization. You're standing on 10,000 years of order. You think your kind ever had a chance to reach this far?" Elias looked up, slow, measured. He didn't reply. He didn't have to. Because the lights flickered. Just for a second. Long enough for the monitor behind the guard to display a line of ancient Terran script. Untranslated. Undeciphered. But the guard saw it. And somehow, it felt, directed at him. A whisper on the screen. "Observe. Then act." The guard stumbled back, uneasy. "What is that? What did you do?" The janitor tilted his head. "Nothing," he said, voice calm. "You just never learned how to look." And in that moment, for the first time, the fear shifted. Not from man to alien. But from empire to exile. The janitor didn't move when the alarms began to howl. Scarlet light bathed the corridor walls. Sirens screamed through the core like wailing banshees, ricocheting off the alloy bones of the station. Footsteps echoed, alien guards scrambling, weapons drawn, confused, scared. Elias stood with one hand on his mop, silent. Still. Watching. They're reacting, he murmured to himself. Finally. Security drones zipped overhead, scanning for breaches. But there were no invaders. No hacked terminals. No explosions. Just malfunctions. Cascading, untraceable, inexplicable. Doors that wouldn't open. Lights that wouldn't shut off. Navigation maps that led crews in loops for hours. And worse, personal assistants, the Concorde's prized AI implants, began whispering wrong instructions. To outsiders, it was chaos. To Elias Wren, it was choreography. Every misfire, every random shutdown, it was his design. Seeds planted over days, watered with patience and silence. The janitor wasn't cleaning pipes. He was rerouting influence, carving a shadow corridor through the Empire's digital spine. And now it was beginning to break. Inside Command Deck 7, High Strategist Velcor slammed his fist against a console. Who is doing this? How is it happening? No breaches, strategist, barked a technician. No transmissions detected. No physical sabotage. It's like the core is folding in on itself. Impossible. Velcor hissed. This system was engineered by the brightest minds in 20 galaxies. He turned toward the surveillance monitors, fists clenched. Screen after screen showed the same figure, a lone human in blue-gray coveralls, moving slowly, methodically through corridors filled with blinking warnings and confused personnel. A janitor. The strategist's eyes narrowed. Pull up his history. I want everything. Moments later, a data stream filled the central screen. Age, 57. Name, Elias Wren. Species, Homo sapiens. Origin, Earth. Former occupation, civil sanitation operative. Captured during Outer Rim patrol sweep. No known military background. No biological augmentations. No telepathic registration. Harmless. Or so they thought. And yet, as Velcor watched, the man paused at an intersection, touched a rusted wall panel, and 3 security bots dropped offline in unison. As if bowing. The room went silent. Then someone whispered, "Sir, he's not using tools. No device. No console. No weapon. Just presence. And a plan." Elias continued walking, each step echoing like a drumbeat of inevitability. Behind his eyes, his mind worked like a warship's AI, calculating pressure points, resource decay, command flow. Once, he had done this during the Orion siege, when Earth had nearly fallen. But that was before he retired. Before he lost his wife. Before he walked away from a life of endless chess with bloodied pieces. They had dragged him back in. Mistaken him for a relic. But relics carried weight. As he entered subdeck C-11, a group of alien guards blocked his path. Tall, armored, insectoid. Their leader leveled a plasma pike at him. "On your knees, primate. This corridor is restricted." Elias looked up. Calm. Patient. "I'm the janitor," he said. "Now." "Of course," he said, stepping forward. Then stopped. "Before I do, could I ask a question?" The guards hesitated. "Do you know what a choke point is?" he asked, tilting his head. Before they could answer, the walls erupted. Not with fire, but sound. A subsonic pulse exploded through the corridor, emitted from hidden ventilation nodes he had rewired days ago. The aliens convulsed, their armor amplifying the frequency rather than dampening it. They collapsed. twitched, screamed. Elias stepped over them, his footsteps calm. "Never build command corridors over metal lungs," he whispered. "They always breathe back." Later, in the deepest vaults of the core, an emergency war council convened. No one spoke of rebellion, not yet, but their eyes betrayed it. And on every monitor, his face. The man they dismissed. The man with no rank. The man now walking unguarded through the arteries of the most powerful structure in the known galaxy. One question hovered in every mind: who is he? But far below, beneath their questions, Elias Wren already had an answer. Not spoken. Not declared. But written in motion, in silence, in strategy. He didn't need recognition. He just needed time. And time had just run out for them. No declarations of war were made. No fleets launched. No bombs dropped. And yet, across the central core of the Zarkethian Empire, fear moved faster than any weapon. Elias Wren didn't storm the control tower. He walked into it. The guard stationed outside simply stepped aside. Not by command. Not out of loyalty. But because some primal whisper in their DNA told them, move, or be moved. Inside, High Strategist Velcor stared at him, jaw clenched, quivering with rage and disbelief. "You're just a janitor," the alien snarled, voice trembling. "How are you doing this?" Elias tilted his head slowly, as if considering whether or not to answer. Then he took one more step forward and placed something on the floor between them. A bucket. The same rusted, paint-chipped cleaning bucket he had dragged for weeks through the core. The same one no one ever checked. From within, he pulled a small black sphere, no bigger than a fist. It pulsed with red light. "Protocol 47, he said simply. Velcor froze. "That's impossible," the alien whispered. "That's Earth-class encryption. That protocol was banned, erased, after the Jupiter incident." Elias smiled. "I wrote it." Silence. Not the awkward kind. Not the defeated kind. But the kind that wraps around the throat of every being in the room and reminds them they've already lost. The strategist's composure cracked. "What do you want?" Elias looked around, taking in the room, its glittering controls, its alien opulence, its arrogance. Then he answered, softly. "Nothing." The council flinched. "I don't want to rule you," he continued. "I don't want revenge. I don't need power. I came to clean." A pause. "And that's what I did." One by one, the monitors on the war room walls flickered. Surveillance feeds, medical reports, drone logs, all replaced by a single image: Elias, weeks earlier, mopping a corridor, while every system behind him was silently being rewritten. He turned toward the exit. "You have 3 minutes to evacuate this deck," he said calmly. "After that, your command AI resets to my design. I suggest you spend that time wisely. No threats. No blood. Just certainty." The strategist stood frozen, his hands trembling above the console. He wanted to scream. To strike. But he didn't move. No one did. They watched the human walk away. He didn't look back. Across the galaxy, word spread like plasma fire. An Earth-born janitor had entered the Empire's most secure stronghold. 3 weeks later, he had rewritten its neural infrastructure. They hadn't seen him plant explosives. Because he didn't. They hadn't noticed stolen weapons. Because he didn't need them. He had used their own systems. Their own overconfidence. Their own refusal to believe. Soon, the Galactic Codex amended its history. Line 1, Section 0, never underestimate a human. Especially one you believe beneath you. Within days, the Zarkethian High Council disbanded. Elias Wren vanished, no trace, no footprint. Some say he returned to Earth. Others claim he disappeared into the starfields, leaving behind only the whisper of his name in the dark. But every few years, when a young alien general questions the threat humans pose, an elder always replies. Ask them about the janitor. And silence always follows. The day after Elias Wren disappeared, the capital of the Zarkethian Empire felt wrong. Not ruined. Not in flames. But different. Ships still flew. Lights still blinked. Orders were still given. But they were followed with hesitation. Whispered, not barked. The soldiers who once strutted through the halls now checked every corner. Doors opened slower. Eyes lingered longer. And the name Wren became a ghost everyone feared to summon aloud. Across the Empire, the ripple effect had begun. On a mining moon in Sector Cult 7, a crew of overworked human laborers were lining up for their daily nutrient rations when the overseer, a brutish insectoid named SKR, raised his baton like every morning. But today, it didn't come down. Because standing between him and the humans was a younger alien technician, arms outstretched, trembling. Don't, the technician said, voice cracking. Not anymore. SKR blinked. You would protect them? The technician's eyes darted around, as if expecting Elias Wren himself to step from the shadows. I don't know where he is, the technician said. But I know what he did. And if even half the stories are true, I don't want to be on the wrong side of history. SKR lowered the baton. That night, across dozens of outposts, humans who had once been beaten, mocked, and discarded noticed the change. The guards stood further away. The tone softened. A hesitation in the insults. A trace of guilt. Not mercy. Fear. In the core archives, High Historian Velra, the oldest living member of the Council, recorded a new entry into the Galactic Codex. The human known as Elias Wren, origin, Earth-class janitor. Role, subverter of imperial hierarchy. Method, non-violent technological infiltration via systemic manipulation. Outcome, collapse of Zarkethian command structure. Status, unknown. Advisory, all contact with Terran-class entities must now be preceded by diplomatic clearance or psychological assessment. Classification level, Omega Prime, existential threat. She paused before writing the final line. Her stylus hovered for a long moment. Then, finally. Perhaps the most dangerous weapon in the galaxy is a patient man with nothing to prove. Meanwhile, somewhere in the outer drift, a small transport ship cruised silently. Inside sat Elias Wren. No throne. No followers. Just a terminal, a pair of old boots, and the soft hum of solitude. He stared at the stars, not like someone who needed them to speak, but like someone who understood they already had. From a hidden compartment, he pulled out a folded note. The corners were frayed, the ink faded. One line, in thick black script. When they finally see what you are, don't rise in anger. Rise in clarity. Captain Juno Wren. His sister. Gone, years ago, in one of the first alien incursions Earth had ever seen. He was a janitor by choice. By grief. By vow. Elias let the note rest on the console. Then he whispered to no one. They took her because they thought we were weak. He stood up, cracked his neck slowly. They'll never think that again. As the stars streaked past the viewport, the transmission beacons across the galaxy flickered. Not in warning. In remembrance. And yet, deep in the Imperial ruins, in the forgotten corners of alien memory, one question remained. Where would Elias Wren strike next, and would it be justice or just a reminder? The Zarkethian Empire had never fallen in war. It fractured from within. Not with explosions, not with betrayals in grand halls, no, it began with whispers. With glances exchanged behind armored helmets. With high-ranking commanders locking their doors for the first time. With the absence of certainty. Elias Wren didn't need to speak another word. His silence now echoed louder than any declaration of war. In the weeks following his disappearance, the council fractured. Some claimed he was dead. Others insisted he was gathering allies. But the worst fear, the one no one dared to voice, was that he was watching. Waiting. In Sector 9 Halex, a squadron of elite Varnock enforcers reported a total systems blackout across their fleet. Dozens of warships drifted powerless, despite being far from any known gravitational anomalies or sabotage points. One engineer dared to connect the pattern. All of the affected ships. They'd been involved in human containment operations. In a panicked emergency broadcast, Admiral Corvin addressed the council directly. This is not coincidence. We are being dissected. From within. And no alarms are being triggered because we designed the systems that way. Whatever is happening, whoever is doing this, they understand our empire more intimately than we do. Silence followed. Then, from the shadows, Counselor Drex, the only one who had spoken against Elias's capture in the first place, whispered that Janitor never stopped cleaning. He's just not scrubbing floors anymore. The Empire had no response. But Earth did. Not through fleets. Not through weapons. But through a signal, broadcasted from a human listening post near Pluto. Just a single sentence, repeated over and over. You taught us how your empire works. You just forgot who was listening. Panic turned to paranoia. Internal investigations turned to purges. Fleets were reassigned to patrol their own borders, afraid of infiltration from within. Entire departments were accused of treason. Friends turned against each other. The iron web that had held the empire together for centuries began to strain, because its strength had always depended on fear. But fear had changed sides. Meanwhile, aboard a repurposed cargo vessel somewhere in the drift expanse, Elias Wren sat quietly across from a young alien girl with bright violet eyes. She wore a translator chip and clutched a cracked data pad like it was sacred. "Why, aren't you fighting?" she asked him. Elias looked at her, tired but kind. "Because I already did. But they're falling apart." He smiled faintly. "They're not falling apart because I attacked them. They're falling apart because I showed them what they really are." She stared. "But you're just human." His gaze softened. "That's the most dangerous part." Back on Zarkith Prime, in the vaults of the Council's central databank, a discovery was made. A single janitor's ID card had been found, but when scanned, it revealed encrypted files, thousands of pages, each detailing vulnerabilities, command routines, psychological profiles of top military leaders, emergency override codes. Someone had been watching. For years. Elias Wren hadn't broken into the Empire. They had invited him in. They had handed him the mop, and with it, the keys. But what terrified them most, was that he didn't use it for revenge. He used it for reflection. The final memo from the Office of Strategic Alien Affairs recorded it best. Elias Wren has done more with silence than our fleets have done with force. He has become a symbol, not of conquest, but of consequence. The Empire is not crumbling because of war. It is crumbling because someone remembered to ask. Why? The Empire didn't fall to fire. It fell to thought. And in the days following the discovery of Elias Wren's encrypted cache, panic didn't thunder through the halls of power, it crept, quiet and coiled, like smoke beneath a sealed door. On Zarkith Prime, the Grand Chamber of the High Council sat half-empty. Not from attack, but absence. Some members had fled. Others vanished in the middle of the night, last seen staring into screens that showed every secret they once believed buried. The silence that followed wasn't peace, it was the breath held before collapse. Because now they understood. Elias hadn't been a man who slipped through cracks. He was the crack. They had seen a janitor with tired hands and worn boots. But those same hands had cleaned consoles where decisions of planetary fate were made. Those boots had stepped over cables carrying the whispers of war. And all the while, he had been watching. Listening. Learning. Not to destroy them, but to understand what held them together. Because once he knew that, he knew exactly how to take it apart. But here was the cruelty of it, he didn't strike. He waited. Waited for them to see it unravel themselves. Waited for the weight of their own rot to pull them under. Waited, for the whisper to become a storm. In the outer colonies, rumors began to ripple through mining fleets and cargo hubs. They say the Emperor's guards refused orders. Did you hear? The station on Helios 3 is flying a white flag, unprovoked. Some janitor wrote a speech that made half a fleet surrender without firing. They laughed at first. Until laughter turned to pause. Pause to whispers. Whispers to questions. And questions were the one thing the Empire couldn't answer. Not anymore. Not when people, soldiers, pilots, cooks, couriers, started asking things like, why did we invade Earth again? Why do we follow leaders we've never seen? Why do we fear a man who carries no gun? On a remote listening post near the galactic fringe, a Zarkethian technician, barely more than a boy, found one of Elias's recordings buried in the comm logs. It wasn't a threat. It wasn't a manifesto. Just a voice. Calm. Even. You don't need to fight for me, it said. You only need to remember you have a choice. He played it again. Then again. And by the third time, he turned off his comm line, walked out of the tower, and never looked back. His report simply read. I remembered. Back on Elias's hidden vessel, now drifting through an asteroid veil to avoid detection, the man himself sat beneath a dim starlight viewport, scribbling. He wasn't building a rebellion. He was writing a question no one had dared to ask in 1,000 years of conquest. What if being strong didn't mean being feared? He didn't need an army. The Empire was already full of people tired of silence. All he had to do was teach them to listen. And so, across the stars, in hangar decks and mess halls, in lonely cockpits and crowded bunkers, the same phrase began to appear, painted, whispered, carved into walls. He didn't clean their mess. He exposed it. The storm had begun. But it wasn't made of thunder. It was made of voices. And Elias Wren was no longer just a janitor. He was the echo that wouldn't die. It began as static. A ripple across the imperial broad net, faint, almost dismissible. Most assumed it was just interference from the dust storms drifting through the Dazari quadrant. But then the static shaped itself. Into syllables. Then into words. And within 7 minutes, across 312 systems, one voice echoed in perfect synchronization. My name is Elias Wren. I was your janitor. Silence followed. And then, stillness. Entire command decks froze mid-task. Fingers hovered above touch panels. 1,000 ships drifted slightly off course. Even on the throne moon of Kerala, where the Viceroy of Defense was known to execute subordinates for merely pausing, not a soul moved. Because the voice wasn't just familiar. It was inevitable. I walked your halls. Cleaned your walls. Listened through vents you forgot transmitted sound. You called me invisible. Unimportant. Replaceable. His tone didn't accuse. It simply was. And that was your first mistake. Across the galaxy, people leaned closer. Even the machines paused their hums. Something about the voice held weight, not in volume, but in truth. You thought power came from silence. From suppressing questions. From fear. But I've seen something stronger than fear. He paused. It's awareness. On outposts circling dying stars, navigators with war-worn eyes whispered the word like prayer. Awareness. Elias continued, his cadence slow, exacting. I watched you kill for territory. For pride. For data. I watched you forget what it meant to exist with others instead of over them. A few screens flickered, revealing archive footage. None of it hacked. All of it, archived from within. Images of council debates twisted by ego, of prisons filled with children from dissenting worlds. And above it all, the silent shadow of the Empire. But I never raised a weapon. I never issued commands. I just cleaned. And watched. And waited. The final line struck like thunder in a quiet cathedral. Because I knew the dirt wasn't the problem. The belief that no one would notice it, that was. In the political heart of the Empire, chaos erupted. Advisors shouted. Generals barked into comlinks. A few commanders even tried to jam the transmission, too late. The message had already imprinted itself onto internal ship logs, personal tablets, even vending units. And then the voice returned. Only one sentence this time. You do not fear me because I am powerful. You fear me because I made you look in a mirror. Elsewhere, far from the Empire's control zones, a small cargo hauler skipped through asteroid debris. Inside, a retired Earth Marine sat listening with his granddaughter on his knee. She didn't fully understand the words, but she saw the tears form in the corners of her grandfather's eyes. He whispered, he did it. He really did it. What did he do, Grandpa? He looked at her, smiled softly. He showed them who we are. Back on Zarkith Prime, the council chamber had gone dark. The great crystal skylight that once shimmered with coded light patterns now reflected only stars. The room that had once ruled half the known galaxy echoed with a single voice. Not Elias's. But one of their own, Counselor Herace, once a hardliner, now trembling. He was right, she whispered, voice cracking. We built a machine so perfect, we forgot why we built it in the first place. And with a slow, deliberate motion, she stood and walked out, her badge clinking against the marble floor as she let it fall behind her. Others followed. Elias Wren never demanded their fall. He only reminded them that it was possible. And once an empire knows it can fall, it already has. The halls of the Imperial Citadel, once pulsing with energy, now stood still, cold, clean, empty. No guards. No dignitaries. No banners fluttering with the crests of noble houses. Just silence. And footsteps. Elias Wren walked alone. No longer dressed in the gray coveralls of a janitor, yet not adorned in robes of power. A simple black tunic, boots worn smooth by years of quiet steps. He moved like he always had, unnoticed, unbothered. But the world noticed now. The galaxy was listening. He stepped into the central command chamber. The room, once capable of orchestrating war across 10 systems with a single gesture, had shut itself down. Not by sabotage. But by choice. 1,000 systems obeyed the one who never ordered. Who simply observed. On the far side of the room stood an interface. One touch, and Elias could broadcast a directive that would ripple across starfields. He stared at it. He didn't move. Instead, he turned and sat, not on the throne carved from obsidian and gold, but on the edge of a supply crate near the wall. The same place the janitors used to rest between shifts. He folded his hands. And waited. Within hours, emissaries arrived. From across the stars. Commanders, scholars, priests, and even former enemies. They did not march. They approached with hesitation, heads bowed, not out of fear, but out of respect. None knew what to call him. Emperor felt wrong. Commander felt insufficient. So they didn't speak his name. They simply asked, "What now?" Elias looked up, his eyes not commanding, but clear. "I'm not here to rule," he said. "I'm here to remind." One alien ambassador, trembling in uncertainty, asked, "Remind us of what?" He paused. "That power isn't a throne. Or a fleet. Or a fear that echoes louder than reason. It's the choice, to clean what others have let rot. Even if no one sees you do it." His voice wasn't loud. But it didn't need to be. Each word dropped into the chamber like stone into still water, rippling. Elsewhere, across once conquered worlds, strange things began to happen. Weapons were dismantled, not by command, but by consensus. Old treaties, once ignored, were rewritten. A statue of Elias was constructed on Ryan V, but he had it removed. In its place, a simple plaque now reads, "It's not who you are when they see you. It's who you are when they don't." And somewhere on the edge of the known galaxy, a young mechanic whispered to her brother, "He's not a leader. He's a mirror." Back in the Citadel, a member of the council, now stripped of title, approached Elias with a datapad. "It's all yours," she said, voice uncertain. "Everything. The Empire, the fleets, the treasury." He didn't even look at it. "I never wanted it," Elias replied. "Then why did you come?" He stood, slowly. Looked out the viewport, where stars blinked like distant, uncertain eyes. "To finish cleaning." She blinked, confused. "There's nothing left to clean." Elias smiled, just barely. "There's always something." And with that, he stepped past her, down the corridor, away from the center of galactic power. No guards followed. No procession marked his path. But across 1,000 systems, in every market, school, and forgotten outpost, the same whisper passed from lips to lips, species to species. "He's still out there." They didn't know where. They didn't know when he'd return. But they knew, they were being watched. Not by a tyrant. But by a janitor. The one who reminded them that in the quiet, in the dust, in the spaces others ignored, truth waits. Time passed. Not in battles, nor in treaties, but in quiet changes. Somewhere on a desolate moon, a child brushed the dust from a broken training drone and asked his father, did Elias Wren really exist? The man, once a soldier, now a teacher, nodded. He existed. But not the way we think heroes do. He wasn't here to conquer. He was here, to remember. Across the galaxy, echoes of Elias lingered not in commands, but in choices. In the sudden pause before pressing a button. In a janitor's careful cleaning of an old corridor. In a leader's decision to listen, rather than shout. In the council chambers of a reborn galactic union, a chair remained empty, not in mourning, but in respect. On its back, carved into the metal, he chose not to sit. They had offered him galaxies. He chose a mop. They offered him armies. He chose questions. And in the end, that terrified them far more. Because Elias Wren wasn't proof of humanity's power. He was proof of our patience. He was proof that humans could wait in the shadows, with eyes open and minds sharp, biding their time, not for vengeance, but for change. And in a universe ruled by force, nothing was more dangerous than a man who cleaned for meaning. On the dark side of a forgotten planet, a small cabin now sits beside a river that glows faintly under alien moons. Inside, a man carves wood, not weapons, but quiet shapes. A leaf. A bird. A child's smile. He listens to the wind. And sometimes, he smiles, as if hearing a question echo across the stars. Why? He never answers aloud. He doesn't need to. Because he already did, with every moment he chose silence over spectacle, mercy over might, duty over domination. He is no longer hunted. He is no longer feared. He is simply remembered. Not as a janitor. Not as a warrior. But as a reminder. A reminder that even in a galaxy burning with power and pride, it's the quiet ones who change everything. If this story stirred something inside you, if you believe that humanity's true strength lies not in domination, but in quiet defiance, intelligence, and enduring will, then join us. Subscribe for more stories like this, where humans aren't just part of the universe. They reshape it. Leave a comment. What would you do if the galaxy handed you its crown? And if you believe janitors can change empires, hit like, to let Elias Wren know he's not alone. We are human. And we remember.